Let's go. Threats in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. The checks are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g1, check. Queen to f1, check. Queen to e1, check. The puzzle is solved using: rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to g2. Rook to g8. Queen to f6, check. Queen takes queen. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f4, check. The best move in puzzle position is: queen takes pawn, check. King to g5. Queen to h6, check. King to f5. g4, check. King to e4. Queen takes pawn, check. King to e3. Rook to e8, check. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are: rook takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. g5, check. Rook to f2, check. The answer is g5, check. Queen takes pawn. Promotes to queen. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Here are the checks: queen to h2, check. Queen to h1, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to h5. King to f1. Queen to h1, check. Bishop to g1. Rook takes knight. Let's continue. The threats are: knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are: queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using: queen takes pawn, check. King to b3. Queen to b2, check. King takes knight. Queen to e2, check. King to b3. Queen to d1, check. King to b2. Queen takes queen. One more. Here are the threats: queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks: f5, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to c4, check. Queen to d4, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: f5, check. King to f4. g5, check. King takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to g4. Pawn takes rook. Next, here are threats in puzzle position: rook takes rook, check. The checks are: b5, check. Rook takes rook, check. Solution to the puzzle is: b5, check. King to d3. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. a5. King to c3. King to c7. Next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. The checks are: bishop to e6, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook to h7, check. Queen to e8, check. The best move in puzzle position is: rook to h7, check. King to g8. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. King to f1. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. King takes rook. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position: queen to h3, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen to h3, check. King to e1. Queen to h1, check. Knight to f1. Queen takes knight. Pawn takes knight. Bishop to c5. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes knight, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to a6, check. Queen to c4, check. Knight to c5, check. Knight to d6, check. Knight to g5, check. Knight to g3, check. Knight to f2, check. Knight takes knight, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: knight to g3, check. King to f2. Queen takes rook. Queen takes knight. Rook to e2, check. King takes rook. Queen takes queen. Next, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. f6, check. Knight to e6, check. Answer to this puzzle is f6, check. King to h6. Knight takes pawn, check. King to h5. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes queen. Knight takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. The checks are rook to a2, check. Rook to g1, check. The puzzle is solved using queen to h4. Rook to b2. Rook to h1. Queen to g3. Rook to g1, check. King takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is h2. b6. Promotes to queen. b7. Queen to f3, check. King to e6. Queen takes pawn, check. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. The checks are queen to b8, check. Queen to c7, check. Queen to d7, check. Queen to e7, check. Queen to b6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to a6, check. e5, check. The puzzle is solved using knight takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. Bishop to e5, check. Queen takes bishop. Queen to b8, check. King to d7. Queen takes queen. e2. Queen to a1. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King to f1. Rook takes pawn. Next, threats in this position are pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using h3. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Knight to g7. f2. Knight to e8, check. King to d8. Another one. Threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are. Rook to d6, check. The answer is rook to h7. Rook to e7. Rook to d6, check. King to e5. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Rook to e6, check. Let's continue. The threats are knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Queen to f5, check. Queen to e6, check. Queen to d7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen to f4, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to c8. Queen takes queen. Knight takes pawn, check. King to e7. Knight takes queen, check. Next, threats in this position are queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. The checks are rook to b1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to d3, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to b1, check. Knight takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to d2. Queen to e2, check. King to c3. Knight to d5, check. King to b3. c4, check. One more. The threats are pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is h5. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. King to d6. King to d4. h4. c5, check. Next, the threats are queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. Rook to f1, check. King to e7. Queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. King to a1. Rook takes pawn, check. King to b1. Rook to a1, check. King takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to b1. a2, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen to d3, check. Rook to c2. Queen takes rook, check. King to a2. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in this position are: Queen to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h6, check. Rook to h7, check. Answer to this puzzle is: Rook to c6. Rook to e6. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. f6. Queen takes bishop. Another one. The threats are: Bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Knight to c4. Bishop to h6. Next puzzle. The threats are: Queen takes rook, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to h2, check. Queen to h1, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen takes rook, check. The answer is: Queen to h2, check. King to f1. Queen to h1, check. King to e2. Queen takes pawn, check. King to d1. Rook to d8. Queen to g5, check. King to e8. King to c1. Queen takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. The checks are: Rook to f2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is: Rook to f2, check. King to h1. Queen takes pawn. Queen to c5, check. Rook to e7. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes queen. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.